The coffee breathed before everything else, dark, hot, the slight bitterness that clung to the ceramic like a promise. A clock on the kitchen wall blinked 5:30 in a soft red. The house above them still slept in layers, drawn curtains, closed shutters, the hush of marble and pausing chandeliers. Down here, where the tile bore the tiny, honest scuffs of real labor, Lívia moved as if the early hour owned her. She tied her apron the way she always did, the knot low so it wouldn't ride up when she bent. Her fingers found their familiar places, the rag hanging from the waist, the wooden spoon nicked at the handle, the small tin where she kept spare hairpins. There was a rhythm to these motions, a private liturgy. She set the kettle, measured grounds with the flat of her palm, listened to the sizzle when butter hit the pan, because even now, in a house whose rooms could have swallowed entire cities, a good egg could still be made right. The smell of vanilla clung to her sleeve. She dabbed a single drop behind her ear that morning, a modest ritual learned at a night class, a little indulgence kept for herself. It was not a perfume to announce herself with. It was an outline, a margin of warmth. It was not for him. He came down the staircase with the soft, accustomed authority of someone who had practiced being watched. Artur Valente had hands that measured spreadsheets and contracts as easily as he now cupped a coffee mug, eyes steady on the woman at the stove. He was at his ease in any room that had windows tall enough to make a man feel like a feature of the skyline. He moved in a world where distances were purchased and decor was curated. Here, at the lower plane of practical life, his silhouette had the curious air of a planet glimpsed at close quarters, familiar, but too bright. She kept stirring. He lingered by the island like a question that had been rehearsed. "Did you intentionally wear that perfume?" he asked. The words were simple, but the space between them folded inward. They were not a compliment. They were not a question out of ignorance either. There was a calculus behind the tone. Was it curiosity? An accusation? A test? Lívia felt the phrase as weight on the pan's edge, a heat that could sear intention out of silence. Her hand paused for the briefest measure. The house stretched toward her with 1,000 listening chambers. She remembered the first morning she'd come to work, the handshake, the stern ribbon of a name tag for the uniform, the exacting walk of the old gentleman who had interviewed her. She remembered promising herself neat things, earnings for the tuition, a quiet dignity in paid labor. She had not promised to become anyone's ornament. "Yes," she answered. The answer landed clean and flat, without melodrama. She chose the plain word, because it kept a distance the longer retort would not. "A little. I like vanilla." He stepped closer. The midpoint between them was a strip of granite dotted with a coffee stain. He reached to touch the rim of his mug, and, in the small arc of movement, closed enough for his shoulder to brush hers. The brush was casual, but the intent behind it leaned heavy, an assessment, a probe. He expected something to move her. He expected a flinch. For many reasons he had trained himself to expect responses. Lívia did not flinch, not because she was unaware, she felt the press, the narrowing of his breath, but because the work taught her how to hold the center of things. There was a steadiness in her that other people mistook for submission. It was not. "Do you—" His words cut off. He was unused to being held steady from the other side. He tried again, but the question had already shifted. What he wanted was to unsettle her, to register a reaction that would map where he stood. She wiped a stray drip from the pan's lip with the edge of a towel and did not look up. "It's for me," she said, "not for the house." There was an honesty in that small clarification, the sort that made it difficult to weaponize. She marked her voice with the same softness with which one might correct a broken tool. For a moment he studied the line of her jaw, the quick, unfussy movement that smoothed a rag in her hand. He noted the way the early light caught her hair, the way the apron cinched her waist. He catalogued details as a man catalogues assets. But cataloging is not always ownership. He had once tried to teach himself the difference and failed, not spectacularly, but in quiet ways he had not named. He smiled then, and it was not the private curl he used for amusement. It was an attempt at something less complicated. "You could say it's not my business," he said. "But—" His voice thinned on the last syllable, uncertain whether to add acknowledgement or demand. She slid 2 plates onto the counter, placed the eggs with the care of someone who respected small rituals, and at last looked at him. Her gaze was level, unembellished, luminous, with a tiredness that was not apology. "You hear a lot here that's not your business," she replied. "This is." It was not a provocation exactly. It was a declaration of borders. The house listened. A clock ticked in a different room as if to record the moment. If this first clash pulls you in, stay with the story to see how power and tenderness collide. The mornings after that had a cadence. She arrived at the same hour, pressed the same spoon against the same pan, and he returned with variations, a casual remark about the newspaper, a lingering look over the rim of a glass. Sometimes his closeness bent around jokes about competence, about how even a man who could engineer takeovers could not flip an egg without ruining the center. Once, when he attempted to show a small bit of domestic ineptitude, his hand missed the spatula and the egg slid. She rescued it with something like laughable patience, and he laughed too, genuinely, for a second that touched him like warmth on skin. Between their sparring and their small corrections, there were simple intimacies that were not declared, only built. A shared bite of toast, taken while the phone buzzed in the study. His placing a napkin on the table because she had no time. Her making sure the coffee pot never went empty when his schedule scattered him thin. These acts were their own language. Neither spoke of them as gifts. They were ways of keeping the day from tipping. Outside these moments, there were the markers of other lives. Donna Neusser, who had been housekeeper long enough that she moved in the dark with the familiarity of a reef, whose eyes read the room like a map. Arthur's mother, Helena, whose presence folded the air into critique. Camilla's portrait in the office, an immaculate photograph like a warning. Conversations crackled at the edges, small and sharp. "You're too familiar," Helena said once to her son over lunch, the words buttered with a garnering of propriety. "Not everyone in this house is a friend." He would bridle at his mother's tone, because she had not yet learned to measure her son's tenderness in human terms. Arthur had grown up understanding that displeasure in the eyes of others could be managed with better cars, safer investments, and a more carefully curated reputation. He had not been raised to fixate on the internal architecture of apology. Lívia's life outside the mansion occupied a different axis. She lived with her mother in a neighborhood that smelled of laundry and fried bread, where the mornings were loud and honest, where her brother Claudio left with a kiss on his sister's forehead and a resigned, "Don't forget your lunch," that meant more than he could say. Lívia paid installments in cash, folded receipts into a ragged planner. She attended technical classes at night in a building where the light bulbs hummed like planets. She wanted a certificate and a small dignity that would not be lost if a boss decided to change his mind. She wanted autonomy. She was not naive about gradations of comfort. She had seen the way money could scoop up problems and hide them, and she had learned to watch the seams. When someone offered help, she listened for the strings. One afternoon, when a rainstorm decided the day should be intimate, Arthur found her at the kitchen window, her hands on the sill, the scent of vanilla faint and human. Outside, rain made the garden look like a watercolor of moving black ink, and the house felt temporarily quarantined from the rest of the world. "You look tired," he said, which in his voice had the texture of note-taking. He knew tired as a variable to be minimized. Better vacations, more sleep, less exposure to stress. It was a diagnosis offered like medicine. "I am," she admitted. Her voice did not invite pity. It merely reported the weather inside her chest. "Classes tonight." He came closer, and that closeness was always the test. He started, then stopped. He had learned how to offer solutions as if they were kindnesses. The flat in Jardins was a recurring idea in his thinking, a unit of space that could be assigned to someone's life, and thereby change its coordinates. It was, to him, a practical answer. To her, it felt like an attempt to relocate, to extract. He watched faces often like a man watching stock prices. He was averse to volatility, offering a flat, calmed volatility. "No," she said. The single word had a firmness that made him relinquish the rest. "I have a plan." He catalogued that answer too, like one more data point. He liked plans he could see. Her plan was a fold of paper, tuition, a timetable, obligations that belonged to the skeleton of life. The idea of moving any part of that life into a building his name touched felt like a theft, even if silently offered. He was not always aware he judged by proximity. There were other times when his restraint failed. Small dominations surfaced, correcting the way she addressed him. Mr. Valente became Artur when he wanted to allow intimacy, arranging the staff schedule without consulting her, commenting on what she wore as if she were an exhibit. Each nudge reshaped a line. Each insisted upon a kind of compliance. And there was a moment when a word from his mouth transformed into an almost physical pressure. It was Helena, visiting for lunch, and she wore the kind of silk that could parade judgment in a color. She watched the house as a gallery of propriety. The conversation steeped like a pot left too long on heat. Jokes that were not entirely jokes. The mention of Camilla like a lacquered refusal of other possibilities. "You should be mindful of staff appearances," Helena said to her son later, as if passing an order. "Not everyone understands boundaries." Artur registered his mother's disapproval like weather. He had strategies for weather. He tuned his expression, apologized for the staff's casualness as a manager would for a broken display, and then went back downstairs where the domestic air smelled of lemon and warm bread. Lívia heard about it because the house leaked. People in service share the small gossip that keeps them human. Noosa told her in the pantry, the two of them, a secretive pair cataloging the day's indignities. "She's a pain," Noosa said. But there was compassion in the way she said it, the kind reserved for misinformed monarchs. But watch him. He listens to his mother like she breathes rules. The moment when the balance tipped came slowly, and then in a sudden collection of small violations. It was not a single outrageous act, but an aggregation of moments that accumulated like dust until the surface could no longer be polished. He began to recast offers as entitlements. A lunch offer became an expectation for informal companionship. A ride could turn into a request for his company at a charity event. The edges blurred, and with each blurring, the house felt smaller for her. At a staff meeting, where the staff schedules were read aloud with the chime of managerial precision, Artur spoke about loyalty as if it were a trait to be purchased. "Those who stand by this house should also stand by its responsibilities," he said, the words like a barometer meant to measure allegiance. Lívia felt that sentence as if it named her by the angle of its delivery. Stand by this house, as if she were a wall rather than a person. She was not defensive. She was observant. That night, after the household had settled, and the house's opulence dissolved into quiet shadows, she lay awake and thought through the scales. There was gratitude. He had never been cruel, not by the measure of his world. He had been kind in small, unsteady ways. But kindness was not the only currency here. There was power, and the temptation to convert affection into purchase was always present. The cell of their interactions could change if unchecked. 3 days later, after a morning that felt crisp and careful, Helena visited again with a satiny imperative about how appearances mattered. Artur retreated to his study after the brief, stilted lunch. She had been summoned into the garden to answer a question about the gardener's wages. On returning, she found him in the library, cataloging a book like a defense mechanism. "You should have said something," she told him, occupying the space of a person who has decided to speak. He raised an eyebrow. "Said what?" "That it's enough," she said. "That you have to respect her space." He looked away then, for the first time showing a hint of the person beneath the polished exterior. "Is she upset?" Lívia was not in the room, but the concern in his voice landed as if it were for an object he worried might crack. He reached for the managerial language he knew: mediation, compromise, contingency. What he had difficulty naming was the fear that a world could drift away that had always been available, like a light he'd expected to switch on at will. The break came in the laundry room, where the house forgot to be impressive and simply served. It smelled faintly of bleach and wet cotton and the small, honest sorrow of work undone. She had been folding a stack of towels, the motions like a metronome, when he stepped in. There was a pamphlet poking from her apron pocket, a flyer for her technical course, the dates, the class schedule, an objective dream folded small. He noticed it as if he had found a bird's nest. Curious, a little trespassed upon. "You still on that?" he asked. The question was not purely about logistics. She stopped folding. There was a steadiness to the way she closed her hands around fabric. "Yes," she said. "I started last month." He moved closer, and this time the proximity felt like a rounding of intent. "You shouldn't work so hard," he said. "You could stop the classes, take a proper rest. I can—" He trailed off. He had the habit of finishing sentences with offerings. "You can buy the course certificate?" she asked, the sarcasm gentle, but edged. He laughed, a small color of discomfort. "No, of course not." She met his eyes. "Then you don't understand." He could see the pamphlet in the crook of her arm, the neat schedule that was not merely dates, but a map to autonomy. It occurred to him slowly, like a man tracing a line he had not yet seen, that her life was not an item on a list to be improved by his interventions. It was a structure she had carefully built with small bricks. In the hallway, Noosa watched them from the doorway with a look she wore often, the weathered expression of someone accustomed to seeing the rise and fall of household tempers. She did not interject. She had learned to observe and to feed the smallest acts of dignity back into the system quietly. An extra pastry on a plate, a folded towel placed where someone could find it. The next week, Arthur offered more, with the same innocence as a man who keeps finding money in his pockets. A check for tuition, a short-term loan disguised as help, the whispered suggestion that life would be easier in a flat where appearances could be maintained. The offers arrived as benevolence but carried undertow, a request that she allow him to be the solution. Lívia declined. She could not. The refusal did not come as an affront. It came as a boundary. It was an assertion of the work she had already invested. She knew what she wanted, and crucially, she knew how to pay for it. Money could speed the construction of comfort, yes, but it could not build the scaffolding of self-respect. She had learned the difference through her mother's quiet insistence on chores done well and debts paid with honest labor. His face, when she said no, was a landscape of confusion and a muted insistence that there must be an alternative. He was unused to being denied without negotiation. He tried then the softer routes, invitations that carried daylight, lunches that might normalize intimacy. She agreed to a lunch once, on a neutral afternoon in the city, where the noise made privacy impossible. It was a short, bounded thing, a test run for civility. They spoke of small things, a book he had read, a recipe she wanted to perfect. It was not a date. It was a conversation. But the public arena did not stop gossip. Camilla's portrait remained in the office, and whispers circulated like shadows. "He's soft with her," someone said in an offhand way at a charity gala. The idea settled in the air like a scent. The tipping point arrived when she felt her options constrict into a pattern she refused to accept. It was not dramatic, a way most violences are not. It manifested in directives from the mother, in casual expectations set by him, in the thinning of the space where she was solely herself. The line finally broke, when a flippant comment became a pressure that asked her to redefine who she was for the convenience of the household. "Maybe you should look more presentable," Helena said one afternoon, as if doling out a simple suggestion. Lívia's reply was quiet. "I am presentable for my job, Mrs. Valente. I do what I need to do." "Not everything is about work," Helena answered. Some things are about representation. The word had the sting of condescension. To her, representation meant being a prop. That was a role she had no intention of adopting. She had watched women in her neighborhood become props for other people's stories and had vowed to herself she would never be one. Inside, she felt a folding of resolve. She had always negotiated. She had always measured the economy of small sacrifices. But there was a felt limit where concession became erasure. She left that afternoon with a list in her pocket and a firm decision rehearsed like a prayer. She compiled all the names of the people she might need to speak to. The union that offered advice, the class schedule, a number for a potential employer where her application had yet to be considered. She wrote a short letter of resignation when she had the space. No drama, only facts. She folded it in the neat way her mother had taught her, the fold that said the paper mattered. When she handed the letter to Noosa, the older woman's hands trembled with the recognition of a choice that had cost someone courage. "Are you sure?" Noosa asked, because some doors closed and never opened again. "Yes," Lívia said. There was an odd serenity in the word. She had wanted the freedom to make this move on her terms, not to be shuffled into a different stage of dependency. She had not chosen him, she had chosen herself. News, properly delivered, tends to shape a house's rhythm. It flustered cooked meals into a small, audible confusion. Arthur read the resignation on his own, the paper like a found object that required inventory. For the first time in months, some part of him registered absence, not as a variable, but as a whole. He did not panic in the way he was used to panicking, with purchases and problems solved by purchase. Instead, there was a hollow sort of astonishment, like waking to a room emptied of a piece you took for granted. He tried in the immediate to offer the same instruments of remedy, an insistence that she reconsider, an offer to pay for the next term in full, a suggestion that she move into a small place where commuting would be easier. The offers landed like pebbles thrown into a deep pond. Each one rippled outward, but did not reach the shore she had chosen. "You should let me help," he persisted. The sentence masked a pull he had always had, the desire to fix what he perceived as deficiency by appropriation. He did not fully see at first that help could be a kind of claim. "No," she repeated, each syllable making a distinct edge in the air. "I don't want your help in that way." He exhaled, a small, nearly inaudible concession. The concession was not grand. It did not look like pride or loss in a way an outsider might notice. It looked like a man who had been taught the wrong currency for a life he had just begun to consider differently. There was a long night where the house hummed with the low sound of things settling. He sat in the library and read documents but could not make numbers into solace. Her absence made a sound like wind moving through a half-closed set of shutters. He found himself replaying small gestures. The way she turned over a pan, the way she tucked a drop of frosting from the corner of a cake onto her thumb. He remembered how she had once, when a thunderstorm had made the city blackout, lit candles and continued chopping onions with a calm that made the storm feel like an annoyance rather than a threat. He realized with a startled, private recognition how much of his day had been laid on small dispensations of her work. This was not purely guilt. It was a new awareness. He understood at a distance that his ownership of space had been a convenience, and that in the convenience lay moral obligations he had not properly measured. The idea that he might have to ask for something, real human companionship not bought with favors or gifts, was unsettling. The next move came from him in the manner he knew best, an attempt at reparation. But it was clumsy at first because he had not learned the grammar of apology. He could buy a plane ticket, gift a flat, sign checks. He had not yet mastered the language of relinquishing control. She, on the other hand, moved into the modest but precise choreography of leaving. Her mother helped, and her brother shared a ride to carry boxes of practical things, pans, a rice cooker, dishes worn soft by years of use. Her departures were not theatrical. They were functional, deliberate. She did not want to be rescued, only to be allowed to set her own line. As she stepped out of the gates that morning, The garden behind her looked like an expanse she had passed through but not belonged to. The scent of vanilla persisted, not as an invitation, but as a signature she kept to herself. Her hand lingered on the iron gate, feeling the residue of warmth that had once meant something different. She did not look back to see if he watched. He watched anyway, from the study window, the glass a mirror that toggled the interior and exterior of a man's life. He noted the way she held her bag, the small kick of the heel against the pavement, the particular pace of her steps. He did not yet know how to ask for a different path. He only knew that the house felt too large for the quiet ache that had opened. She left the gate with her head held the way she always did when she was making space for herself. The city took her in, noise, the smell of rain that had been foretold, the regular cadence of vendors, the presence of people who had names and debts and small, stern joys. The neighborhood received her not as someone from a glossy house, but as one of its own, an agent of her own life. Her body, once attentive to the expectations that had been placed upon it, now carried a new, minimal freedom. That afternoon, Arthur walked into the kitchen with a paper in his hands. It had no legal weight. It had only been folded into the shape of an offer. He had written, in the clumsy way of someone unfamiliar with being vulnerable, an invitation to meet. No strings, he hoped, just conversation. He hoped selfishly and earnestly that reparation could be bought a second time, or at least requested. Before he left the kitchen, he set down a small container of cookies, the sort that could be eaten quickly with coffee, as if food were the language his house spoke when words were insufficient. It felt like a feeble peace offering and also an honest symbol of the limited grammar he owned. She received his message that evening, a short note asking if she would consider speaking, perhaps at the park, perhaps over coffee at a neutral place. He had made the mistake, or the modest attempt, of not making it an ultimatum. He asked. She kept the question like a hinge. The days after her departure stretched in two different directions. For her, hours were filled with lectures in fluorescent rooms where the teacher drew circuits, with a lunch break spent under a poster that announced certification dates. Her hands still learned new skills, wiring, soldering, the lean precision of technical diagrams. For him, the hours were absences counted in a ledger of echoes, empty chairs, coffee gone cold, the odd roar of a high-powered, pointless machine that now did not need to be tended. He called once and left a message that was more awkward than he intended. She did not answer. It was not rudeness. It was economy. Her time now was priced, and she had the precision to spend it where it mattered. She answered later, with a brief message returning his offer to talk with a date and a place neutral enough to keep safety intact. They agreed on a meeting at a park bench by a small lake edged in reeds. The park was a different kind of house, public and neutral, where conversations were visible but less likely to be framed as obligations. He arrived early and sat with his hands folded in a way he used for negotiations. He had prepared an apology, which he had written and then rewritten until the lines felt cleaned of everything but truth. It was not a long apology. It did not need to be. It needed to be honest. She arrived with a composure that was honed and real. She walked as someone who had just picked up new tools and was learning their weight. Her presence at that bench was not a surrender. It was a controlled, deliberate step to contend. She sat without making a show of closeness and placed her bag on the bench between them. Its presence was a small, tangible assertion that she held her world with her own hands. He spoke first, stumbling over the language he had to learn, remorse, recognition, requests for permission to be heard. He admitted he had been wrong. He admitted that his offers had felt like purchases, and that he had not seen how that felt to take. She listened as someone who had had practice with patience. Sometimes, in that listening, he saw how thin his previous understanding had been. When he had finished, a quiet settled. He did not demand forgiveness. The apology had been too late for that. He asked for conversation instead, for permission to try to become someone different. She looked at him, really looked, with a gaze that catalogued not only remorse but the possibility of an effort. She had no illusions about the ease of transformation. She had also learned through the classwork that one could test the sincerity of someone's change by small, repeated actions over time. Actions, she said simply, not promises. He swallowed and nodded. The pledge was modest and oddly difficult. He had the instinct to orchestrate a neat resolution, but she was insistent that the rhythms of change did not permit theatricality. They separated at the lake with no grand gestures, only the suggestion of a path. It felt almost mercantile, measured, honest, a bartering of trust for effort. Neither believed in tidy endings. That evening, rain came hard across the city, a sudden, cleansing sheet that turned sidewalks into slick mirrors. She was walking home, hair tucked under a hood, carrying a small tote with a textbook. A bus splashed past and scattered the pavement with a streak of muddy water. For a moment she hesitated, then continued, steady, unhurried. He watched from a distance, waiting on a street corner as if the rain could help him rewrite a wrong by soaking it clean. He did not call her that night. He sent instead a message admitting he had thought of a way to show he would not try to buy the change. He suggested, modestly and without garnish, that he would enroll in something, counseling for control, classes in listening, if she agreed to let them meet again. It was not a grand gesture. It was a practical, awkward offer, but it was one of the first times he thought to place his own labor on the scale. She read the message and did not answer immediately. She had learned to be cautious with hope. It was a complicated thing. Sometimes it opened doors one did not intend to enter. Days later, one small but consequential exchange arrived that neither of them could have predicted. He mailed back an envelope, or rather, he asked a courier to return something she had left on the counter, the pamphlet for her course. The gesture could have been an act of possession. Instead, it was a decision not to possess. It was, in its awkwardness, almost a sacrificial statement. He had the means to buy anything on the pamphlet. He chose not to. She received the envelope on a bus, the city outside the window a smear of neon and storefronts. She opened it and found the pamphlet folded neat. There was a note inside, short and without pretense. I respect your plan. No substitution. The nerve of that small sentence reverberated. It was not an apology. It was a boundary he had shifted away from ownership toward respect. For his part, the act was an exercise in humility, a small, imperfect transgression against himself. He had returned a thing without attempting to replace it with something larger, recognizing that the shape of her life belonged to her. When she read the line, she did not cry. She smiled a private, iron smile, the kind that belonged to someone who had constructed a life of necessary defenses. The city moved around her, indifferent and constant. But even with that kernel of progress, the history of the house, and the mother, and the small, inexorable movements of power remained. Nothing altered overnight. There were still stares that asked who she thought she was, still the complicated mapping of desire and entitlement. He still had to learn to pay attention to the micro steps of respect, the way you ask, the way you stop assuming. She still had to decide whether small improvements were enough to admit someone into the life she was building from the ground. On a rainy Wednesday, she packed a small bag in the quiet of her mother's home. Dishes, a coffee mug, the tin of spare hairpins. Her mother watched her with the kind of eyes only a parent could wear, eyes that record history, but do not always correct choices. Claudio hoisted the boxes and grunted approvingly at the result. "You got this," he said, as if speaking a talisman. She left a note for Nusa, a short line that kept to the tone of practical kindness. In the notebook of her life a page turned. The gate closed behind her, not with a slam, but with the measured click of a lock engaged. The city welcomed her with its ordinary, beautiful indifference. He watched from the window until she disappeared into the gray smear of a morning market. Then he went to his study and sat with a pad of paper and an intention. His hands trembled as he wrote out things that felt like new verbs for him. To ask, to wait, to listen. He knew the work would be more than a neat apology. It would be a long apprenticeship. She navigated the day the way she had learned to handle storms. Practically, with clothes that dried quickly, and a resolve that warmed her like a sweater. The day was made of lectures and small, stubborn joys. Learning to solder a circuit correctly, laughing with classmates about a failed experiment, receiving praise for a line drawn true. That night, as she slept in a room that smelled faintly of lemon detergent and not the expensive perfume she sometimes encountered, the vanilla behind her ear felt like a private signature. It had not been an invitation. It had been a claim. In the mansion, a small tremor of awareness began to widen. The absence of her hands was a persistent note. He found that the details she had managed, the specific roast of coffee, the particular arrangement of napkins, were things he had come to expect without acknowledging. He had a clutch of defensive habits, but he had also learned a new ache, the recognition that a person's labor is not only convenient, it is generative of tenderness. He drafted messages that felt inadequate, and sent one with the care of someone who had begun to value the mundane as sacred. "Can we talk?" he wrote, as if the simplicity of the question could open the right kind of doorway. She agreed to speak again, not because she trusted him fully, but because perhaps humans are also repositories of second chances if those chances come with terms and accountability. She wanted change that was honest and visible and not paid for with her agency. They arranged to meet at a small cafe, a neutral place with an old counter and chairs that had seen many conversations. Outside, the sky held the tired softness that comes just before rain. Inside, the smell of coffee braided with the scent of pastries. She entered without fanfare and saw him already seated, looking out the window as if testing whether the world would allow him to be someone he had never been. He stood when she arrived, an old-fashioned courtesy, and the space between them felt like an unfinished instrument. He did not reach to touch. He only asked if he could sit. She nodded. The day carried with it the faint perfume of rain and the residual vanillas of the past. They ordered coffee, and none of it tasted like a solution. He spoke, haltingly, of errors he had made. He did not attempt to excuse or to buy the remembrance away. He said, "I saw how my offers looked. I didn't understand." His hands wrapped the cup as if to anchor himself. "I want to do better." She listened. She pressed her thumb against the rim of her cup and found the heat steadying. "Doing better is not about money," she said. "It's about how you behave when I say no. It's about letting me make my own choices." He heard the words like a manual he had not been given in inheritance. He wrote them down on a napkin, as if committing them to a ledger. It was a small, noiseless conversion. They left that meeting with a map rather than a plan. Small steps, accountability, times to check in, and an agreement that actions would replace promises. For him, it was a first draft at humility. For her, it was a measured attempt to see whether someone could alter his language of power. The months that followed were not a montage of swift forgiveness, but a slow calibration. He showed up to the meetings he had agreed to. He enrolled in a group where men discussed control and entitlement, an awkward place for a man of his station, and thus a place where he would have to show up without the buffer of wealth. He volunteered in small ways around the city, not with announcements but quietly, and he learned to accept that his gestures might look strange. She continued her classes. She wired circuits that lit like tiny suns. She learned a measured pride that had nothing to do with him. She cooked for her family, and when she occasionally visited the mansion to collect a forgotten item, the air between them retained a new equilibrium of distance and civility. It was not linear. There were backslides. There were times when she caught him watching her in a way that made her chest contract with old instincts. He faltered, offering again to buy something he thought would help, when what she needed was to be heard. She called him on such moments, and he would apologize. Briefly, then adjust, learning to correct course. He had a teacher who would not let him off the hook, his own discomfort at being an insufficient man for what he wanted to be. One afternoon, 90 days after she had left, an invitation arrived that neither of them had written in the same hand. A small, public gesture, her name on a certificate list at the technical school's ceremony. He was there, as she expected and did not expect, standing in the back with a bouquet that was modest and a little out of place among corporate parrots. She did not accept flowers on stage. She did not accept flowers on stage. She walked across the small auditorium with the diploma folded between two fingers like a map she'd learned to read. The lighting made everyone's faces a little softer. The world outside the technical school felt temporarily cropped to the rectangle of that room. He stood at the back, a hesitant presence, clutching a small bouquet that looked embarrassed among his tailored sleeve. He did not come forward when she stepped down. He did not want his arrival to be a spectacle. He had learned some lessons about how spectacle could be a form of possession. The applause washed over her in a way that was both ordinary and strange. People she had studied with cheered for the circuit she had soldered and for the neatness of her notes. Her mother waved from the third row, eyes bright and careful. Claudio lifted a hand in a lazy salute as if to say, "You see?" He had stood up for her in ways that didn't need grand architecture. He had shown up with boxes and blunt jokes, and the kind of love siblings owe each other. She found him when the crowd thinned by the exit where the sunlight touched the threshold. He did not offer flowers. Instead, he handed her a plain envelope with a small card inside. No flourish, no attempt to buy the moment. On the card, written in a hand that trembled with unfamiliar effort, he had put 3 words, "I'm learning." That was all he had thought to commit to, and to her it sounded like a mercy. For a second, she expected the old chessboard of power to re-emerge, the test of what he could purchase for forgiveness. He met her eyes, and without ceremony, said, "Congratulations, you did this." She looked at him, the certificate heavy and warm, and allowed herself a small, private smile. "Thank you," she answered. It would not become easier just because the ceremony had a stage. The work of mutual trust would still need scaffolding. But there was a new substrate to build on. His willingness to be seen stumbling. They stepped into the sunlight together and walked toward the curb where people waited for buses. He walked beside her for a few meters and then, as if remembering the lesson that had cost him so much, kept his distance to allow her pace to set the tempo. The bouquet remained in his hands like an exhibit he was learning to respect rather than possess. In the days that followed, progress came in the form of small, skeletal victories. He started to show up where she lived, not as a man entering territory he aimed to own, but as someone willing to be awkward in foreign space. He rang the bell at the low building where her mother kept a tidy apartment lined with practical furniture and photos of relatives. Donna Vera opened the door with a mixture of curiosity and caution. A woman who had watched her daughter leave the gates of a rich house and return with a look that had hardened into deliberation. When Arthur offered his hand, Donna Vera accepted it, as if testing whether he had the texture of earnestness. The Sunday dinners at her mother's were unvarnished. They were full of conversations that didn't require translation into polished image. Arthur learned to chop onions with clumsy competence, a ceremonial humiliation that made him laugh and made her brother cluck like a practical judge. He learned to carry plastic bags of groceries up a flight of stairs and to refuse valet eyes. He sat at the table and listened to talk of neighborhood gossip, to the price of rice and to jokes about the bus route, small human things that had no currency but were the economy of belonging. Lívia watched him in these moments like one who measures patience. She watched how he reached not to rearrange the room, but to place his hand where he could help, peeling a potato, washing a pan, listening to the trivial pain of a neighbor. When he left that evening, he did not make grand promises. He left with a palpable, practical humility, and the sly grin of a man who had been taught, by ordinary chores, that dignity is not an object to be bought. Back at the mansion, he negotiated other terrain. He began to ask where before he assumed. He developed habits that felt mechanical at first and then slowly human, asking permission before giving a gift, phoning to check on her schedule rather than sending messages that assumed availability, asking whether it was all right if he attended the technical school's open house as an observer rather than an intruder. He stopped the automatic reflex of using money to solve things. Instead, he learned to listen and to offer time. There were tests. They arrived like weather, sudden, expected, and impossible to control. One evening, Helena arranged a small luncheon, the kind of event that served as a social litmus test. Invitations in the Valente house were never casual. They were calibrations. The dinner was set with fine china, and a photograph of Camilla, stoic and perfect, occupied a place of honor in the study. Arthur accepted the luncheon invitation, knowing, perhaps, that the true test would be less about what was served and more about how he navigated his mother's script. Helena appeared with the posture of someone who had always curated respectability as armor. Her remarks, soft as silk yet barbed, tested the atmosphere the way one tests a seam. She made comments about presentation and implied, without naming it, that some people needed guidance on how to represent. The room tilted in the way it often did when power acclimatized itself to boundaries it had previously ignored. When the moment came, Arthur did something that surprised the small crowd more than any flamboyant possession could have. He spoke to his mother plainly, not loudly, not as an attack, but with the quiet, precise firmness of someone who had rehearsed the grammar of respect. "Mother," he said, "Lívia's work and choices are hers. If she chooses how to wear herself, that choice deserves to be respected, not commented upon." The sentence sat in the air, a new kind of currency. It did not erase the unease, it rearranged it. Helena's face flushed with the color of insult and perhaps a grudging acknowledgement. She had raised a son to be decisive in public matters. She had not foreseen that decisiveness might be used in defense of someone she considered an improbability. Her retort was thinly veiled scorn, an attempt to reclaim authority, but the exchange had shifted the room. The staff who had watched from the margins felt something in the air like a new wind. Nusa, in the pantry, allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. The household had long been a theater of etiquette. The scene at that luncheon made the set tremble. Lívia felt the skittering of old discomfort, but also a relief. The man who had once been content to silently catalogue her presence had now spoken to protect it. It was not a grand redemption. No single act could wipe clean years of habit. But when a person in power begins to choose to speak against their own family's instincts, the movement is notable. Not all gestures were so public. Much of the repair work happened in the quiet, almost antiseptic arena of everyday choices. He learned that a small, deferential act, sending a message asking whether it would be okay to visit, calling to ask about a day's timing, counted more than a single expensive token. He learned to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how to fix things and to ask her what she needed rather than assume. They took to making agreements that read like modest contracts of mutual respect, times when one could enter the other's life, terms of privacy, how to handle social events. She demanded, with unshakable clarity, that he stop bringing up the idea of moving her into a flat as a way to solve logistics. He agreed without theater and wrote it down in a list they both could see. The list became its own talisman. It included things like ask before showing up, discuss gifts before giving, and name boundaries plainly. He signed it with a pen that trembled slightly. She kept the sheet in her bag like a blueprint. The country of affection they were attempting to cross required constant cartography. Sometimes he misstepped, a misplaced compliment, a curiosity voiced at a bad time. Sometimes she was abrupt. She had earned the right to be protective of her time and autonomy. Each mistake produced apology and recalibration. The rhythm was not romanticized. It was honest labor. A particular test came on a rainy afternoon that felt like an examination, less of endurance than of daily ethics. She had frayed nerves after a long shift, and the sky threw itself down in silver sheets. She decided, impulsively and with stubborn independence, to take a bus rather than accept his car. The bus moved through the city with a meditative slowness, a litany of stops and everyday conversations. He stood at a corner and watched it recede, the city in damp focus. When she stepped off 2 blocks from home, water beaded on her hood, textbooks protected beneath a plastic cover. He was already there, waiting under a shop awning with 2 paper cups of coffee he had bought with exact change and without fuss. He did not arrive with a car to rescue her. He arrived as a man who had learned that the true test of respect is to show up without trying to alter someone's chosen path. She accepted the coffee and sat on a low wall, dripping, and for a while they sat with the world sliding by in front of them. He apologized for past behaviors with a simplicity that made the words sound like work done. "I thought I could smooth everything," he said. "I didn't see I was erasing you." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. The vanilla behind her ear had not been a summons. It had been a token she kept safe. "You were trying to fix, yes," she said. "But fixing isn't always the same as helping." He listened. He listened in the way people listen when they remember they are not the only ones carrying weather. There were moments of tenderness, always negotiated, always with explicit consent. The first time he kissed her after all of the work was not in a mansion's hallway nor framed by any grand gesture. It happened one night when they were both tired and honest, and had cooked dinner together in her mother's small kitchen. They had been laughing at the mess they had made, a pan burned at the edge, a sauce that had decided to thicken too much. They washed dishes with slow, cooperative movements. At the sink, while rinsing a plate, he reached to dry her hand and asked, with a practiced awkwardness, "May I?" Her answer was a soft yes. The kiss that followed was brief and consensual, something like a punctuation mark that said, "We are trying." It was not a seal on a completed reformation, but a sign that 2 people could choose the same intimacy freely. There was no heat of possession. There was breath and laughter afterward, and the quiet recognition that small pleasures could be mutual and not curated by imbalance. Not everyone in their orbit approved. Gossip threaded through the neighborhood and through the Valente house in equal measure. Camilla's photograph remained in the study for a while longer, an old signal of an old arrangement. Arthur never removed it without discussing it with her. Rather, he asked what she thought, and when she said it made her uncomfortable to see historically intimate images hung like rules, he quietly moved it to a shelf where it might be seen, but no longer presided. It was an action that read less like theft and more like consented redecoration. Helena's acceptance came in increments and in ways that were not always generous. She had to learn to translate a son's evolving vocabulary of respect into her own metrics. Sometimes that took the shape of grudging silence. Sometimes a faint concession like a compliment when he helped her at a luncheon, clearing plates without pretending he had not been wrong before. Their family conversations shifted from edicts to negotiations and, to the relief of some, sometimes to boredom, an unremarkable but healing rhythm where battles were fewer. There were relapses, of course. Men who have practiced the old language of entitlement sometimes revert under strain. One evening, in the mansion's kitchen, where the tiles still bore traces of the hands that had worked it for years, Arthur mistook an untied knot of tension for consent and tried to step too close in the conversation, pressing for a kind of emotional intimacy she had not agreed to at that moment. She pulled back sharply, and the room filled with the sound of a boundary being set. He stopped. He listened. He did not offer excuses. He sat with the discomfort and learned to make discomfort a classroom rather than a justification. The way he corrected himself in that moment, immediate, unperformative, counted more than any rhetorical apology. Time continued its patient work. They developed rituals that were neither grand nor easy, a weekly check-in over a phone call where they named where they'd succeeded and where they'd faltered, a promise to attend without comment, the moments that meant something to the other, course presentations, a work fair, a small family birthday. He learned to value schedules that did not bend to his whim. She learned slowly to accept offers when they were given with respect and not as a pretext to control. The neighborhood noticed a change too. The people who frequented the small padaria where she sometimes ate in the rain began to recognize his figure there, untied tie, plain coffee, eyes patient. He never tried to pretend he belonged in the same way. He existed awkwardly in the margins he had once thought unworthy. and the former stiffness of staff interactions in the mansion eased. Noosa allowed herself more jokes, and the staff, relieved, began to move with less of the small anxiety that had been the scent of daily labor when proximity to wealth required constant vigilance. Then came an evening that encapsulated much of the journey. A Sunday where the rain had died, and the air smelled like washed concrete and wood. They had been invited, half by agreement, half by curiosity, to spend the afternoon at Ibirapuera, a place neither private nor pretense-filled. They walked, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes in conversation that migrated from the banal to the surprisingly tender. He pointed out a hawk circling overhead with an awkward attempt at poetry. She corrected him with a smile and a fact. They shared a pastry, then a bench, then stories they had not told each other in the early months when power skewed the scales. At a small pavilion by the park, she told him about a childhood summer where she had stayed up late learning to thread beads into earrings to sell at a market. He listened as if cataloging not assets but an origin story. "You were always making yourself," he said, more as an observation than a compliment. She looked at him with something like grateful reflection. "I had to," she replied. "Making yourself is different from being made." He nodded, understanding in a way that had not yet been fully scribed into his daily practice. There was a simplicity to that afternoon that made both of them feel less like actors and more like people practicing a new grammar. The months stretched into a fabric of ordinary life, where their interactions were sometimes smooth and sometimes frayed. There were reparative acts, phone calls returned promptly, small favors offered and accepted on equal footing, the occasional shared meal where the bills were split without discussion. There were also reminders of the fragility of their new balance, a misunderstanding over a social media comment that spiraled of its own accord, a careless remark from a cousin that reopened a fissure. Each fissure required repair, not by wealth, but by conversation, and sometimes by silence. On a warm night, they found themselves back in the mansion's kitchen, now sometimes a neutral space rather than a theater. He had again attempted to master the egg, and this time, the center had not run. The simple victory made both of them laugh. They ate at the island, leaning on elbows like two people practicing domesticity on terms they had agreed upon. He reached, without thinking, and brushed a fragment of something off her cheek. He paused, remembered their long months, and asked, "May I?" She nodded, and his hand rested there for a moment. No claim, just care. That night, after the dishes were cleared by their mutual effort, they walked to the gate together. The smell of vanilla lingered behind her ear, the wood of the gate warm from the day's sun. He opened the gate and did not assume she would step through with him into a life dressed by his house. She chose to walk beside him. Their hands found each other in a natural fold, fingers interlacing like two separate threads deciding to braid without pressure. They had no illusions of perfection. There would be more tests, more small aggressions of habit that needed correcting, more social scenarios where old scripts attempted to reclaim space. But there was also an accumulation of small, visible changes, words used differently, intentions asked rather than assumed, a list of boundaries kept folded in a purse and honored like a covenant. He learned to ask before he sat in a chair that belonged to someone else. She learned to accept affection when it arrived wrapped in humility. They both learned that love that lasts is less a blaze and more a collection of tiny, repetitive corrections. At the garden gate, Helena's voice rose behind them, an attempt perhaps to gather herself, to call them back into the old drama. She offered a sentence about appearances that was more habit than malice. Arthur took a breath and simply answered, quietly but firmly, that he and Lívia had their own terms. His reply carried the new weight. He had chosen her autonomy over a tidy social script. Helena's mouth tightened. For a moment, she looked like the woman who had been certain of the world. Then, to the surprise of no one who had watched the slow work of days, she turned away. Acceptance would come in increments, and perhaps for now in silence. They crossed the threshold into the city together. It was not a cinematic finish, There would be no triumphant trumpets or tidy resolutions. Their story did not promise to erase inequality. Money still existed. Social maps still had contours. But the shape of their relationship had shifted, if not enough to mend every crack in their worlds, enough to make a different life possible. One where choice was spoken aloud, and where gestures were checked by consent. On the corner, where the wood of benches smelled faintly of rain and the pavement held the ghost of earlier storms, they paused. The vanilla was a private signature against the air. He looked at her, not with the old cataloging gaze, but with a gaze that had learned to ask questions and to sit with answers. "Stay with me here," he said, not as a command, but as an invitation. She considered the street, the bus clattering by, the modest apartment where her mother waited with a kettle and a habit of quiet approvals. She thought of the technical school and the small diploma still tucked in a drawer. She thought of the many ways a life could be tended. She took his hand and squeezed, an unmistakable but gentle agreement. "For now," she said, "we keep learning." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had begun to know the work ahead. They walked on together, not into a resolution that erased the past, but into a daily practice that honored consent, the dignity of labor, and the slow accumulation of changed behaviors. The perfume of vanilla blended with the smell of wet pavement and the wooden benches, a small emblem of their shared, imperfect life. Would you have given a second chance? Tell us in the comments, and if this story moved you, consider subscribing for more.